My my pleasure and privilege to be here. I should say it's funny. Today's February 1st. For a long time, when I wasn't important enough for people to fact check things, my birthday was listed on Wikipedia as February 1st, and the only reason I didn't correct it is because I like being associated with Langston Hughes in that way. I'll talk briefly about the Million Book Project, and then I think it'd be nice to have take some questions and sort of just have a conversation. It's fascinating, actually. I have seen Langston Hughes papers in the Beinecke, and what's interesting for me, and when I think about doing archival work, and when I think about going into the papers of these writers that I grew up admiring, is recognizing that when I first started reading Langston Hughes, when I read the Ampersand biography, and when I read the Big C, I had no idea that writers kept papers. I had no idea that it would be possible to go back and read the letters that they wrote to other writers and the way in which they supported the career and the challenges and they help support other writers and sort of how they confronted the challenges that they faced. Um, but also just for me, like Langston Hughes has always um, been that writer that Langston Hughes has always been that writer that had to be a working writer. And I think a lot about, what that means because I sort of always consider myself a working writer, which is to say that I've had to write and produce in a lot of different genres, just to make a living. And I think one of the things that did for me is it's kind of made me recognize the importance of supporting other writers. It made me recognize the importance of trying to build something that would be of support to other writers. I'm a talk in circles for a second, so the people listening don't have to forgive me. But the first fellowship you listed that I had was Cave Canem, and I think Cave Canem is a prime example of writers doing a lot of um, exceptional work to support other writers. Cornelius Eady and Toy Derricat started Cave Canem to make sure that young writers had access um, to our elders and to the poets who already had proven their excellence and who could help us become better writers and thinkers. And so, what is really important for me is to try to do something like that. And I think the Million Book Project is essentially my effort. And so, I want to talk a little bit about the Million Book Project. First, is to say I'm struck by this. I didn't learn about writers in school much at all because I went to prison when I was so young. I went to prison when I was 16. And so what that meant was I think maybe the only writers I've been introduced to had been Shakespeare. We read Julius Caesar. We read the book about the boys who ended up on an island and ended up losing their mind and killing Piggy. And and ironically enough, the last book I read in 11th grade before I went to prison was The Scarlet Letter. I didn't realize it was auguring so much of what would happen in my life in the future, but in some ways it was. And so then I got locked up and I had my own fascination with literature. And the way I found books, really all of the books I came to love was happenstance. Somebody would let me borrow a book, or I would go to the library and just pull something off the shelf, or I would hear an author mention another author and read that book. And what that meant was after I did my 8.5 years, in many ways my reading was broad, but in many ways it was like huge holes in it. I never read Saul Bellow. I only read a little bit of Faulkner. I never read. I could just run down the list of writers that I hadn't read that I wish that I read or I wish that I'd been aware of or I wish that I had their books. And so what the Million Book Project is what would you do confronting a situation like that for other writers? And I should say this actually. This is most significant for me as a poet because a lot of poetry books. Can my volume be turned up? Oh, I'm sorry. I had on my radio voice. Can you guys hear me now? All right. I hope you guys can hear me now. I turned my volume up and I am speaking slightly louder. And so I should say one of the most significant things, though, the most significant things about the Million Book Project is when I was inside, I was reading a lot of poetry, but I was only reading anthologies. And so I wanted to create a way to ensure that folks inside now could read full collections. I wanted to make sure that a book like mine, or a book like Toys, or a book like Cornelius's, that come out and have 1,000 book print run, that it could be accessible. And I should say, like, one interesting story about all of this is when I was inside and I knew I wanted to be a writer, I wrote all of these folks letters, and I wrote Cornelius. I wrote Toy. I wrote Lucille Clifton. I wrote Rita Dove. I wrote everybody a letter. But the thing is, as a reader, you have no reason actually to look at a copyright page. Like, if you just love books, you want a scholar. So I would pick up books and I would read them, and I would sort of fall in love with the writing, and I would try to write writers from prison and just tell them, like, I'm locked up. I'm a poet. I think I'm pretty good. I would love if you would just read some of these poems. And I would send the letters out, not understanding that in terms of being a writer, a lot of times it's like being a barnstormer, and you go from college town to college town to college town, from fellowship to fellowship to fellowship, building a life. And so I would never get any letters back. And so part of the Million Book Project is to say, how do we bring more writers into people's lives? But how do we bring contemporary voices into people's lives when those books get published? So that you're not just reading a John Edgar Wyman book and enjoying it that was published in 1984, but you're also reading a book that he published in 2016. So that you aren't just reading the first book Sonia Sanchez published that you were able to get your hands on, but you're reading the latest book that she published. And also so that you don't miss out on the contemporary writers. The Cave Canem poets, when I went into Cave Canem in 2006, none of us had books. And well, few of us had books, but now you have Tahimba Jess with a Pulitzer Prize. You have Tracy K. Smith with a Pulitzer Prize. You have who else got a Pulitzer Prize? I can't remember. I can't believe I can't think of her name. Natasha Trethewey with a Pulitzer Prize, and then you got countless other awards and honors, and just a lot of great books that literally don't exist in prison right now. And that's not even going into the contemporary fiction and the contemporary memoirs that just don't exist in prisons. So that takes me to the Million Book Project. I'm gonna talk about the Million Book Project for a second, and then we'll open it up for questions. I got this thing, right, and I'm gonna try to do it here, and it's not gonna work because it's not set up to happen. But I'm gonna see if I could do it here just because y'all here, right? So imagine this: if you're in prison, the one thing you can't do is turn and like see a bookshelf like that, right? You can't like reach out to the bookshelf and grab a book. Nope. If you're in prison, your world looks like this. And that's how my world looked like when I was in prison. Complete darkness. There was no library. If I had a book, it was because somebody was kind enough to give it to me. If I had a book, it was because I was working for 23 cents an hour and I saved up the money to buy a book that I desperately wanted to read. I sent books to friends of mine. I probably sent in, hundreds of books at this point. And the books that I've sent in to friends don't even touch the tip of the iceberg of the books that I've been able to read. I was talking to somebody once, Elizabeth Alexander, actually, and Julie, who's on the Mellon team, and we were talking about what would be possible. Like, what would I do if I had ambition to like do something bigger? Yeah, I'm gonna uncover it. Um, Somebody said, "Can you uncover your lens right now?" It's like being in solitary confinement. You want to get free, but you can't. And the idea of this is like, how do you make somebody viscerally feel as uncomfortable as people feel in prison? The question is like, yeah, I mean, I could uncover it right now, but the question is, if you were locked up, you don't get to get the light that you want. And the Million Book Project is about how do you provide people with the light that they have no access to. And so asked, so I'm gonna go back for 1 second. So asked, what would I do if I was being my most ambitious? My answer was I would bring light to people in prison. And part of that light would be books. And I would bring 1 million books to people in prison. And the Million Book Project is that idea. And how am I doing that? Or how are we doing that, this team that we put together? Well, first, we're curating a collection of 500 books and we're calling it a Freedom Library. And we recognize that the books aren't the end all be all, but a decently stocked personal library is a good solid 500 books. And so we building out the 500 books. And we're also having a series of literary ambassadors. And these are contemporary writers who have committed to going into prisons and giving readings in prisons. Charles Dickens was writing about prison in the 1800s, and he's still, to this day, one of the few writers I think who has gone into prisons and written about what they've seen. I can't really name, most of the amazing contemporary writers that I read um, have never been inside a prison. And part of that is because prisons don't create spaces for people to come in and give readings. But the other part of that is that it is no real expectation. Although we talk about mass incarceration, we actually don't talk about what it means to go inside of a prison and just like see inside of a prison and be seen by the people inside of a prison. And so one of the critical components of the Million Book Project is to have a literary ambassador in every state and have that person commit to going inside a prison to see and to be seen. And the other aspect of it is not to just send the books in, but to build a bookshelf. The notion that you should have something that is a testament to more than the violence, desperation, and absurdity of prison that you see every day while folks on the outside are fighting to get you free. And so we're having a design team, some architects build a bookshelf that will bring some beauty and vitality to the prisons, but will also hold the books and it'll be a functional thing. And then we also built a podcast called The Freedom Takes. COVID has been a real, as everybody knows, has been a real disaster. And while we have learned to practice social distancing and we've learned to wear masks when we go out in public, we've learned to take more walks. If you are like some friends of mine who are incarcerated, what COVID has meant is that you spend nearly 24 hours a day in a cell, that you get 40 minutes every 2 or 3 days to go out of your cell and take a shower and make a phone call if you could get on the phone before they tell you to go back in your cell. And so one of the things that we've done is one, we've started sending out books right now. So we sort of seat in book circles, just an opportunity to send 20 copies of one book into a prison. But two, we've created a podcast with the idea being how can you visit a prison right now? Well, you could do it via podcast. And in that podcast, it starts out with a 10, 15-minute reading from whoever the author is that we're interviewing. And then we interview that author for 30, 40 minutes. And we've been developing that and sending those inside, primarily to juvenile detention centers right now. But we're also sending copies into to the prisons. So I think I've talked for close to 10, 15 minutes. I'll stop now and we could kind of have a conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Dwayne, and invite people to begin putting questions into the chat or to the Q&A. I wanted to sort of tee one up, which is you've got a website that's going to be much richer this week. So I wonder if you could talk some about that and what people will be able to see there.
Yeah, you should just, it's a story to the whole project, actually. And I tried to tease the story with the conversation that we just had, but the story on the website will be more explicit. Break it down the origin of the Million Book Project, break it down some details and aspects of the curation process, giving you a list of the people who have already committed to be literary ambassadors. And, wildly, we probably have, the shit is actually quite impressive when you think about it. I mean, we have all of the major publishers that have been partners. They're sending 20 copies of a book in, 100 copies of a book in. We have some of the best writers in the country that have already committed to taking a part of this. I just recently interviewed with Elsa Hardy, my co-host of the Freedom Takes. We just interviewed James McBride, and it's just a fantastic interview. And so the website will give you access to all of that information. You can subscribe to the newsletter. You can subscribe to the podcast. And most importantly, you could donate. A lot of people say, what can I do to help? What can I do to help? Can I give you my old books? Can I give you the stuff I no longer want? And I say, we would love to take your old books and send them into prisons, but prisons don't accept old books. One of the ways that we've been able to facilitate this whole project is because they know that the books are essentially coming directly from the distributor into the prisons. And it's, 500 brand new books that I purchased specifically for this project. And so when you go to the website, you could donate now, but in the upcoming days, the website will be more fuller and you can have a better sense of where any donation you give will go to. Uh, but one example is we bought 1,000 copies of Jason Reynolds' Long Way Down, and we sent it to juveniles, to people in juvenile detention centers across this entire country. We just sent out 200 copies of Jasmine Ward's recent book. We sent out a couple hundred copies of Miriam Tave's Women Talking. And so that's sort of one aspect of where the funding that we receive goes.
Great. And your colleague Molly has put in the chat for everyone the URL, which is millionbookproject.org. So I hope everybody will look at that, bookmark it, and make sure to visit later in the week. Question.
I'm gonna answer the first question because it's hilarious. This is I'm sorry to laugh at the question, but the question is do many prisons in Connecticut have libraries? And so that's a very serious question. I think prisons across the country have libraries to varying degrees, but this project, one, will supplement libraries that exist, but two, this is sort of more than a library project because the intention is not, so we'll put this freedom library in the actual library because it's a special collection of 500 books, but we'll also put it where the guards have access to. So it's their own special freedom library to emphasize that the power, the purpose, the things that books grant us access to aren't just for people that's incarcerated, it's for all of us. But finally, the freedom library is about putting this library in the actual housing unit so that when you wake up in the morning and you walk out of your cell, you can see these books and it could be a part of the landscape of what you're experiencing as you prepare to leave. um, People could study and men and women in prison study. I taught myself Spanish in prison. I used to wake up 6 o'clock every morning, study. I would wake up at like 5:30, but I would study for an hour or two before breakfast. Then I would study for an hour before lunch, and then I would study for an hour before dinner. People study in prison. They study in solitary confinement. They study on the rec yard. They study in their cells. But do people in prison have personal computers? I got to tell you, nobody in prison has a personal computer. And often people in prison don't have access to computers at all. We are completely analog. And even when they have tablets, I think tablets become, in my eyes, a lot of times more of a detriment because they use the tablets to decrease access to physical letters. I got a stack of letters. I bet I can show you. I got a um, stack of letters right now written from people in prison asking to be a part of the Million Book Project. I got a stack of letters, a bigger stack than this, that's written from that's written and sent to me from friends of mine. And those folks sent me those letters over the I've been home for about 15 years. So they've sent me those letters over the span of 15 years. But the tragedy is that right now, if I were to write any of those people back in a lot of states, instead of giving them my physical letter, they would like send it to Florida, have it photocopied, and then send them the photocopy. So a lot of prisons are trying to reduce the ways in which you could actually reach out to touch your loved one. Like they can't feel the texture of your handwriting on the paper that you mailed them. They can't feel the texture of the paper, the sort of you know 100-pound paper you bought just because you wanted them to feel something that was beautiful in the prison. And so we emphasize less the access to electronics, the access to tablets, and more so the access to the physical, hard, tangible book, because that's what's frequently missing in the lives of folks inside.
Number of people have asked questions regarding censorship by prison officials. So I wonder if you could talk on that, how that impacts what you're doing, how you'll deal with that.
I don't know about censor. I mean, I won't. I won't say no one censors books in prison, but I would say that it's quite complicated. And I'm very much an advocate. I am very much a literary advocate. I'm very much about increasing the access to books in prison, but I don't think censorship is as big a problem as people discuss. And I survived prison by not wanting to fight all the time and finding out what matters. And so some books we might choose not to get in. Some books we might choose not to even attempt to get in. But it'll be 500 books that we will fight, tooth and nail to get in, and we'll have some substitutions. I think my book got censored. I had a fucking chapter called "How to Make a Knife in Prison." So I sent the book in, and I sent 12 copies into my homeboy because he wanted to start a book club, right? And it was already copies in the libraries, and it was already copies there. But when the 12 copies came, the guard was like, "Hold up, 12? Who buys 12 copies of one book? Something is wrong." And so they go through the table contents and they say, "How to Make a Knife in Prison?" Oh, they planning a riot. This is not going down. And they banned the book. And then I happen to have some lawyers. I happen to know some lawyers, and we wrote a letter saying that we plan on taking y'all to court if y'all continue to ban this book. And then we had a conversation, and the conversation was, well, Mr. Betts, the chapter of your book is called How to Make a Life in Prison. You must realize that that could lead to violence in the institution. And I explained to them what the chapter was about. And I was like, this is like the Fisher Price version of making a knife. You could learn that from Tom and Jerry. I was like, my friends read that and they laughed at me, talking about what was I revealing. And we talked about what was actually in the chapter, and they conceded that I was right and that the book didn't pose a threat to institutional security. A lot of times when people talk about censorship, you will not hear those same folks tell you a story about the steps that they went through to sort of challenge it and have a conversation with somebody on the other side. So I think censorship won't be a huge issue for us. I recognize the importance of it, but I think our project will fight censorship by getting great books in that may have at one point been censored, but we'll be able to make the case for why they shouldn't be censored, and it'll just be easy sailing.
Someone asked, quote directly, what book might you slide under the door to your 16-year-old self now?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I once gave a reading when the Question of Freedom came out. Some child's mama was like, "Will this book keep my son from going to prison?" And I said, "Books don't do that. Books don't keep people from going to prison." I said, "The conversations that you have about books keep people from going to prison, but it's never the book." And so, I could name 10 books. I mean, right now I'm obsessed with Marlon James' Black Leopard, Red Wolf. I would hope that somebody would slide that under my cell when I was under my door when I was 16, my bedroom door, my cell, or if I was in prison, my cell. But I would also say, I mean, Driest English is amazing, and this is the driest, most boring book ever, but it's about grammar, and I find it fascinating. I would say, um, the fifth season, N.K. Jameson. Part of what I would say is the book that I want to talk about in that moment. That's the book I would slide under. I just read Erica Sanchez's "I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter." I would slide that book under. But I think, what's the last book? I read Wild Seed by Octavia Butler. That is the book that I would give somebody. But what happens though is if you start giving somebody books and you start having conversations around those books, you long to keep that conversation going, and so you go to the next book and the next book and the next book, and there's no easy answer because the best answers, I'm gonna frequently give you books and constantly talk to you, and it's those conversations that will build out the world. And that's why we chose 500 books, so that it's not just one. It's like 500 opportunities, 500 gateways, 500 maps.
Someone asked a question about, are you going to be organizing book clubs? So I wonder if you could talk about, in addition to the actual establishment of the libraries, what other programming will be going on with the Million Book Project?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a project that'll be putting these freedom libraries in prisons in every state in the country and Puerto Rico. And what some people who work with us keep telling me is, in a lot of ways, it's an absurdly ambitious project, and you really have to figure out exactly what it is that you can do and that you can do well. And we already recognize, for instance, the Minnesota Writing Project. They got a great writing project in Minnesota. They've invited me out. I went into the prison. I read some poems. I talked about writing, and then I sort of gave a lecture to the larger prison population. So what we're doing is we're providing support for these programs. Um, um, Deb Unworth has a great program in Texas. We've sent hundreds of copies of books to her, and so she already has this network of men and women in prison that she's working with. So we send the books in to support what already exists. And then though, what I did do, because I used to be a part librarian, I used to work in the law library, and what I did do is say, how can we encourage the creation of things to happen in prisons that don't now exist? I was in a prison that didn't have anything. We didn't have any programs, and we didn't know what a book club was. Why would I know what a book club was? I got locked up at 16. It seems like a foolish idea. I'm gonna read a book and talk to people about it. I mean, it's absurd. And then if you introduce me to it, I realized, oh, I've been doing this my whole life. And so what we've done is, we've reached out to some librarians in California, for instance, and we asked the librarians to reach out to their employees to say, like, who is proficient at running a book club, like when COVID is no longer disaster, and then we have them recruit the people who work for them to run book clubs, and then we'll provide the books for them. So it's not like, we just can't do everything. But what we can do is encourage others to create the things that need to be existing, in those spaces, and then support them by providing them with books. And also we've been working with this organization called Break Free Education, and we've been sending reading guides. So we can support them by providing them with books, and we can also support them by providing them with reading guides. But the idea is not to try to reinvent the wheel. Zelda here at Yale, she has a phenomenal program. I don't have to do what she does. All I have to do is say, look, I got 25 copies of James Baldwin. You think your guys would want to read and organize some reading groups around this Notes of a Native Son? And she says yes, and we send it in. We send in 65 copies of Sadia Hartman's Beautiful Women, Beautiful Experiments, and we let them do the work. But the point is, we're providing something for them that doesn't now exist because, frankly, books might be a old technology, but it's an old expensive technology. It's really easy to provide one set of books to somebody. And so for organizations, it's easy for them to say, we could buy 20 copies of one book, but when they want to do that consistently month after month after month, it just has a real cost to it.
You noted that in some ways it's an insanely ambitious and amen to that and to the ambition of it. An idea in the chat, which maybe you already have tackled, but if not, will there be book plates? And if so, and if not, might you consider having graphic designers collaborate with you on special book plates?
See, this is the thing. I love questions like that, right? Because they make it feel like I planned ahead for this. And it was one other question I should answer that's real good because I just talk about fiction all the time and poetry because I love it, but nonfiction is included. And I will talk briefly about the curatorial process next, so that people could get a sense of like how we went into this. But so I got a, we got a logo, and it's a sculpture book with wings and some kefir. And I mean, it's really like a testament to what literature is. It is the thing that we imagine might grant you freedom, might give you flight. Frederick Douglass once says, with a book, you're forever free. And so that is sort of the tagline for our project. And we are having book plates made to be centered in each book, because we also understand that books are living, growing, libraries are living, growing organisms. And as we deal with attrition and we add new books and we help them expand and we help them be maintained, we want those books when they walk away and when they circulate from one person to the next to always have a stamp of the Million Book Project, to always had a stamp of this book with wings, because we think it's a testimony to possibility.
Great. So you want to talk a little bit more about the
Oh,
curatorial and genres and all that?
yeah. So we had a few. I'm not sharing a list of books today, but I will share a list of books on March 4th. And when we share the books on March 4th, you will hear the significance of March 4th. I would tell you right now, but then you won't tune in on March 4th. So, so, so that's a teaser. Somebody just asked about the list of books. But so what we did is we did a few things. First, we did a survey, and the survey went out to a few hundred people. A few hundred people filled it out, and they got like 10, 12, 13,000 recommendations. I should say first, I started in my own head. What books do I think are necessary? And then we did this survey because it wasn't just like the Dwayne Betts show. And then I looked at my own bookshelf and I realized that my bookshelf is a combination of things. It's a combination of books that I've read and that I love and that I hope to one day read again. Books that I just want people to see when they come in my house so that maybe they'll take it off the shelf. It also has books that were gifts that I want to read, books that people gave me that I respect those folks. And I'm like, one day I'll read that. And then it has the books that I purchased thinking I know I have to read this. And so the shelf is a combination of all of those things. And it's idiosyncratic. You have a book about drawing next to Ghetto Side. You have James Baldwin's essays next to Misdemeanor Land. You have a stack of law books that's too heavy for anybody to carry sitting right beside a magic book. So it's like a idiosyncratic kind of thing. You got cookbooks on my shelf. You got a run of 10 August Wilson books sitting beside a run of 3 Shakespeare books. You got a fascinating novel called Geek Love. You got All God's Dangers, which is nonfiction, which is the oral history of this guy named Nate Shaw. So the bookshelf is an idiosyncratic thing, and we wanted ours to be just as idiosyncratic. So we started with me, and we started with Molly, and we started with Tess, and we started with Elizabeth Hinton. And then we moved out and we had the survey done. And we sort of combed the survey, had people not just talking about books, but why they love books. Then we had these focus groups. We called them book circles. And we would have 4 people come together in a room. And we made this argument that anytime you got more than 2 people together talking about books, the Million Book Project is there. And so these 4 people, 3, 4 people would get on Zoom and they would sort of do a happy hour with each other, but they would talk about the books that they love. And we recorded those conversations. And then we would go to those conversations to get ideas about um, just what books we should use. And what became fascinating is like uh, Sasha Weiss from the New York Times. This is what she said about Zimborska. She has all the wry, weary humanism of someone who has seen the most atrocious expressions of humanity and survived it, and found art as a way of coping. A lot of her work feels like she is in a museum of human specimens post apocalypse. She's interested in geology, she's interested in art, she's interested in people. It just has the air of a very wise person picking up the ruins, turning them over and finding loveliness and regenerative power. She feels kind of like God, who's seen all of human history and can find kernels in it that retain meaning. So the idea was like not just to get books, but to hear why people love books. To hear that somebody read Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking and then reread it every year after year after year because it reminded them of somebody they loved. And our intention is to pass that on to our readers once we decide what books we'll choose. And then finally, we consulted a series of experts, Jill Lepore and a bunch of others, to just talk about books that they thought were like necessary in their field and in their area of expertise. And then sometimes, like I was talking to Elizabeth Hinton, and what was it? It was Eugenides. It was his book. But she gave the most impassioned sort of defense and explication of why like that book was necessary that you would have ever expected. And so what happens is, when people talk about things they love, it brings power. And we pulled all that together to help build out the list of 400. I mean 500.
That's great. So you mentioned tune in on March 4th. People can go to the website. Where should they go on March 4th?
Yeah, they should go to the website millionbookproject.org, and so you'll see it now, but it'll be live. The full website will be live later this week, and so say you go back next week, you'll see a counter at the bottom that's like a countdown to March 4th, and it'll be fun.
Good. And we'll, from Beinecke, make sure to everybody on this list to follow up also with the direct message to folks in your email inboxes. Question about resistance from corrections officials. And I guess I'd flip that as well. I'm sure there have been people who've embraced it. So I wonder if you could just talk some about experience working with prison officials across the country.
Yeah, I mean it's been good. We haven't worked with people in every state, and so I will say, but we will work with people in Indiana, Texas, California, Oregon, Washington State, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, uh, Connecticut, and North Dakota, Minnesota. And so we worked, and then we've sent in books to 30 different states so far and over 100 facilities. So we work with at least 20% of the country, and we've gotten very little pushback. I mean, and part of this is that I think part of this is that we picked our partners well, and part of this is that I've been to prison, and and they be like, hold up, wait, you was in prison and now and then you went to Yale Law School and you're doing this. And I think that's a little intriguing. And they recognize that I know a little bit about where I'm coming from or what they're doing and what are their challenges. Um, but the other part of it is we've been really smart about picking our partners and we've been really smart about building relationships. And like I said, I think I think the temptation is to see the world in really clear lines of good and evil. And so even the questions posed about resistance instead of collaboration. And we've had far more collaboration than we've had resistance. But the question is posed as a frame about what we think about mass incarceration when no correctional officer ever locked anybody up. And I'm not saying the correctional officers are holy, but shit, I gotta at least talk about them with the same decency I talk about the men and women in prison who committed crimes. You know what I mean? So it's like part of it is trying to recognize that it's a really, really difficult space for a lot of reasons. And if you want to get to yes, you got to recognize why it's difficult, how it's difficult, and work to get to that yes. And this project is about, when I was locked up, I couldn't name a single project that was for people incarcerated. And even the advocacy work that's going on now, it's for freedom. It's for freedom, but it's not necessarily often to change the material conditions of men and women doing time in prison. College programming reaches what, 1, 2, 3, 5% of the prison population. So I feel like it's my duty to get the yes. And getting a yes means that I need to emphasize um, the positive aspects of this program, not just for the people incarcerated, but for the people who work in prisons. And sometimes, it is just a struggle, and it's a struggle because you got to build trust in a space where prison guards don't think that somebody who did time in prison is like amenable to their perspective and is willing to try to work with them to make something happen. But people have been, and definitely during COVID they have been. The only thing that has slowed things down is people dying. It's like administrators saying, "Listen, we're in the middle of a crisis right now, and can we get back to you in a month? Can we get back to you in 8 weeks?" But I've been and I'm not trying to act like it's like all hunky dory, right? I'm not trying to paint a false picture of how difficult and challenging it can be. But I think from the very beginning, our advisory board includes Leanne Birch, who ran North Dakota Department of Corrections. It includes Scott Simple, but it also includes Dr. Ruthie Gilmore, who's one of the preeminent abolitionists in the country. It includes James McBride. I mean, listening to James McBride talk about people in prison, you recognize the sort of humanity that sometimes when we talk at the margins, you lose out on. So I guess I'm just trying to say that you win by refusing not to win. And we have created a groundswell of support that we think will carry us over. And that support isn't just like support is also among institutions that fervently want to change culturally from top to bottom, and that are working with other organizations to institute that change, to have a new model of corrections. And so you win by finding those places and working with those places and creating pilot programs that works with the hardest places to work in and works with some of the easiest places. I'm in North Dakota. It's like not a Black History project. I mean, it's like what do you tell the prison population in North Dakota about what you want to read? But it was this little white girl in Wyoming that wrote me a letter and said, "This book made me see myself in ways I hadn't seen before." And I was like, "This book?" I was like, "Are you talking about this one?" Because they write us letters. They write us letters back about the books that we send them. And so it's been a real pleasure, I think, for me to help, lead this effort. So yeah. And somebody asked about Maya Angelou's case. It's in prisons all over the country. I mean, like, yeah, Maya Angelou's "I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings" is allowed in prisons all over the country.
Uh, to jump off of your talk about collaboration, wanted to give us what's probably a softball question, but about our mutual friend and colleague Elizabeth Alexander and Mellon. And Mellon is doing some of the greatest work, I think, in terms of an institution really engaging and changing and developing. So I wonder if you could talk some about the role that Mellon and Elizabeth have been playing with you.
Yeah, I got I was right here. I met Elizabeth Alexander in 2006, and we were talking, and I asked her, some just for some work that she'd written about black men. We were just kicking it, and she gave me her book, her copy of Black Interior. It still got the stickies in it. This is the one that she was reading from at the time. It got the dog-eared pages so that she could get to where she wanted to read. It got her notes in it, and I kept it. And the first time I came out to Yale is because she invited me and John Mario and Marcus Jackson and Randall Horton to give a reading at the AFAM Center. And it's wild though, because when I was in prison, I was at Augusta Correctional Center, and this spot had the interlibrary loan. And I told the librarian that I wanted this book by Elizabeth Alexander, but we ain't have it in the library. And she requested it through interlibrary loan from the local library, and she was able to get it for me. And so for me, like this whole notion of libraries and importance of literature and how it really opens up opportunities and opens up a world really began with Elizabeth Alexander, and I think that as a even before she was at Mellon, she's had a lot of belief in the work that I've been trying to do around advocacy and literature. Her work with the Art for Justice Foundation. I mean, I think that when we talk about a lot of the stuff that's been happening over the past 5, 10, at least over the past 5 years, her name will be in the center of it. It has been like remarkable leadership. It has been completely unexpected. I mean, like art didn't exist, I think, in the same conversation with advocacy as it does now before the work first with the Ford Foundation and now with the Mellon Foundation. And unsurprisingly, because they don't tell me who to work with, right? I'd be like, yeah, well, I built this partnership with such and such. We working with Mass Design to have them build the bookshelves. And I don't go and check out what Mass Design is doing independent of our relationship with them, right? But then it's like, oh yeah, they got the grant from the Mellon Foundation to lead this effort and this initiative. And so what you find is that Mellon is just supporting really, really fantastic work across the board. And at this point, I'm never surprised when I discover who would be an appropriate partner for this project, to know that they already have some connection to Elizabeth and to the Mellon Foundation and to others that we've been working with. So yeah, I can't speak highly enough of her work and her vision.
You mentioned public libraries, so I'm going to use the opportunity and put in the chat. In 2 weeks, Dwayne will be with Toyd Ericott and Cornelius Eady, who he mentioned, in an event, really an extraordinary evening from New Haven on Mardi Gras on February 16th at 7 p.m., an event to support the New Haven Free Public Library. So encourage everyone to take a look at that. There's a question about non-English language books. I wonder if you could talk some about that.
Yeah, I learned at so because I learned that like I learned how to speak Spanish in prison, and so I find that that's just extremely important. Um, so yeah, and we haven't decided what the percentage will be. So first, when we actually go into Puerto Rico, most of the books will be written in Spanish, but we do have to have a subset of foreign language books. We haven't determined how many and how we'll make those decisions. But I think one example is sort of you might think like we have a couple different translations of the Iliad, so it's sort of like that. You might have it's challenging though, right? Because you want to have 100 years of solitude in Spanish and English, but you want to recognize that even a children's book in another language is really really challenging. Like the first time, because you forget that like a kid's book is written in four, two, three, four different tenses, and because you know the language, you don't really hear it and you don't recognize it. And so one of the challenges is that you want the library to be eminently usable, and sometimes foreign language books only cater to the population that speaks that language. So we want to have some reach. So of course we're going to have some, but it is really a struggle to figure out what is the appropriate number. 10%, 15%, and one of those challenges of equity too, because if you do, I mean, the default has to be Spanish because it's essentially so many people in the country that speak Spanish. I was in prison with dude when I was learning Spanish. I learned it talking to dudes named Papo in Venezuela, and Perito, and I remember playing soccer with them and them talking to me in chopped up English and me talking to them in chopped up Spanish. And that's how I built my understanding of and my ability to speak in Spanish. And so I want to sort of honor that, but at the same time, in honor that, I don't want to. Being a library is a difficult. I'm not a librarian. Actually, librarians get quite offended when I use the word library more than 5 times in a single conversation. So I try to keep it down to a minimum. But I've learned to respect the work of librarians immensely through this project because you are, especially if you're just doing 500 books, you're trying to cater to to a huge, varied population as if they aren't huge and varied, and it's a huge challenge. Actually, it's just like requires a level of thoughtfulness that does not go into our own personal study habits. I literally only read black poets from 1960. So that's not true. But like in your own personal life, I mean, you could be getting a PhD, and in law, and literally only read books about mass incarceration, and you find differences in the new Jim Crow, and our prisons obsolete, and misdemeanor land, and um, worse than slavery, and slavery by another name, and you find differences in all of those books, and you could talk deeply and specifically about how they're different, and forget that everybody else in the country recognizes those all as making the same argument. And so, like, which ones do you include in the library? And that is sort of the struggle in every sort of specific genre or area of interest, and in terms of the language books.
Uh, there's a lot of librarians on this webinar, and I know from conversations in advance and looking at the chat, all the librarians I know are delighted and excited to have you part of the work, and appreciate anything you say about libraries and librarians. Elizabeth Alexander, when the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened, had a piece in the Washington Post that said, historians and archivists are heroes. And I think the librarians perhaps too, and the kind of work you're doing to have prison libraries is the work of heroes. I want to give you the opportunity for any final word, be respectful of your time and everyone else's time, and conclude this webinar. A reminder to everyone that these programs, Mondays at Beinecke, are every Monday at 4 p.m. Next week, a number of my colleagues from Beinecke Library will be speaking about the recent acquisition and digitization of the Walter Evans collection of Frederick Douglass and Douglass family papers. So I encourage everyone to come back next Monday and visit our website. And
Mhm.
make sure, again, Million Book Project, to visit the website, bookmark it, visit it again later this week, and we'll all get ourselves obsessed with the counter to March 4th. But Dwayne wanted to give you the opportunity for any final words.
Yeah, I think I will just say that somebody said something in the chat that I think is cool. But two things. One, and I do recognize that a lot of books are written in English in another language, and that is one way that we'll work around the sort of challenges with the language and having the translations is great. But two, somebody said something like Dwayne should be honorary librarian. And I appreciate that. But the reason I appreciate that is because I do think that we don't value librarians enough in this country. I do think that in the school system we aren't taught about the value of librarians. We think of them just as like people that show us how to use the Dewey Decimal System. And in fact, in my entire life, while I was in prison, and since I've come home, librarians have been essential to me figuring out what it means to be a scholar. Has been essential to me figuring out what it means to discover great works of previous time, and also to make those connections. My first real job in prison that I was most proud of, I was like a pod librarian, and I took it seriously. Because like dudes is coming in and they're like, "Yo, Dwayne, give me." Well, they call me Shahid. Like, "Shy, give me something to read." And I couldn't be like, "Oh yeah, you should read Things Fall Apart," to a dude who I know only reads romance novels. Like librarians have to have the kind of respect and awareness that it's like, what is the gateway book that'll push him to something else? And how do I approach him and treat him with the dignity that he deserves just because he is a reader? Somebody says every reader is book and every book is reader. And I think that I deeply believe that that's true, and I appreciate this space, sharing the space with you guys, and I hope you continue to follow the Million Book Project. Check it out, millionbookproject.org. March 4th, come check it out, see why that date is important, and check out the book reveal. And I kept some things up my sleeve. You got to check it out just because it's a few things that we haven't talked about yet. I'm the poetry editor for the New York Times Magazine. A lot of people tell me that they don't like poetry. Every week, it's a poem that I picked. I think about that as a parallel to the Million Book Project. So you should check out my selections week by week by week. But I thank you guys for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you. And I'm just going to quote from the chat. Thank you so much and happy fake birthday. See you.
See you.